Hi there! It's the end of another month, and as we're sweltering in heat here, it's time to both pay rent and do a roundup of the books that we've read. I've got a good mix of some sci-fi, some dystopia, some weird novellas, so let's dive into it. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and May was a pretty good reading month for me, I think. I managed to get a good balance done between reading advanced reading copies or ARCs for books I was meant to review, catching up on some other books I'd wanted to read, and getting some work reading done. So I'm going to just dive straight into it. The first book I read in May was a novella called Hollow Inside by Asako Otani, a Japanese novella which was translated by Ginny Tapley Takemori. This is a weird one. It's brief, it's about 112 pages, and it's about, how do I explain this? It's about two women who choose to live together. Our main protagonist really is Hirai. She's 38, and she's just started living with her colleague Suganuma, who's 42. They both live in Japan. They're both somewhat disaffected adults. Their work is boring, it's not really challenging, they don't have relationships, and life is expensive, and it's actually cheaper for them to live together so they can afford a nicer place to live. They don't really know where they're going. So it's a bit of a frustrating read in that sense, if that is something you can relate to. Because you're sort of like, yeah, well, where is my life going? And what are we going to do? And where can we get satisfaction from? How can we be content, even happy in life? And those are not necessarily questions that the novella is going to answer, but they are questions that they're going to ask you. So if you're up for a read that kind of challenges you in that sense, then absolutely go for it. This kind of disaffectedness also emerges in the writing itself. It's very to the point. It's not overly descriptive, and yet I could picture almost everything very clearly. We kind of watch Hirai go through a couple of dates, trying to figure out what she's going to do with life. It's all just quite... I think that's actually the best way to describe it. The title of the novella, Hollow Inside, comes from a side hustle that Suganuma has. She 3D prints these figurines of pets that have died for people, and these figurines are hollow on the inside. But so is her life, so is Hirai's life. And it's like, what can we fill this up with? Or is just the external hull enough? Can we sort of fake it till we make it? As far as I'm aware, this is a debut novel/novella by Asako Otani. And although I wasn't necessarily absolutely in love with it or amazed by it, I was very intrigued by it. So I'm definitely up for reading more by Asako Otani when that is translated, since unfortunately I cannot read Japanese. I will say I've read translated Japanese literature before, specifically translated by Ginny Tapley Takemori. And as far as I can tell, obviously with my absent Japanese, she's an excellent translator. And she really gets the vibe of the novel across, I would say. My second book was a reread of the third novel in the All Souls series/trilogy by Deborah Harkness, The Book of Life. And I read this because a friend is currently going through that series/trilogy with her own sort of book club with her friend group, and I've been waiting for her to get to the Book of Life. So she was like, yeah, we're doing it now, and I was like, yay. And then I raced through it in a weekend because I do adore the All Souls trilogy/series. The reason I'm calling it a trilogy/series is because initially All Souls had 3 books: A Discovery of Witches, Shadow of Night, and then the third one, The Book of Life. But in the years since, it has gained a couple of extra books, which I have not yet read. There's Time's Convert, The Blackbird Oracle, and I think there's more coming out, actually. So I haven't read those, so for me it's still a trilogy, but it is technically a series. This book series is about a witch, Diana Bishop, who falls in love with a vampire, Matthew Claremont, and that is forbidden. Also creatures, so witches, vampires, and demons are hidden. They hide themselves from normal human society, and their love affair sort of blows up part of the rules that are laid out for their life, right? But I adore this series. It's one of the few ones where I will accept an immortal vampire falling in love with a mere mortal, where I'm like, yeah, no, this makes sense. Like, Diana is, she's not an 18-year-old wallflower. She is an accomplished woman, a woman who works hard, who has her own life. And is this spoilery? Not necessarily. Because I'm keeping this super vague because I don't want to talk about the third installment in the series because that will spoil/ruin the other ones. But what I love about All Souls is that Diana, she starts off as a somewhat normal witch, and across the books she sort of gains more insight into her powers, into her abilities, into her position really, and she starts to transform a little bit. With all the descriptions at the end, she is almost this completely transformed, ethereal, but also maybe somewhat monstrous figure. That's how I read her, at least, and I adore that. I love that she's the weird one. He might be a vampire and he might have his own issues, but she is the one who is scary. So I can wholeheartedly recommend the All Souls trilogy. If you like combinations of fantasy with a dark academia somewhat background, because Diana Bishop is a professor, she works at a university, she does research, and, well, if you have a fondness of Shakespeare, maybe, if you like very sumptuous historical background that is also quite grounded in actual research, because Deborah Harkness does know what she's writing about, then have fun with All Souls. Please do. The next book I read is one that I bought literally like 2 years ago. And I've had it on my nightstand ever since, knowing that I wanted to get into it eventually. And this month I finally did. And that's The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, which is translated by Stephen Snyder. So the book originally came out in 1994, but I think the translation is a lot more recent. And The Memory Police is about an island where things disappear. They can kind of feel it coming, that something has disappeared. When the people living on this island wake up in the morning, they're like, something has gone. But what is it? And then they realize, oh, it's birds. Birds have disappeared. And of course, the birds are still flying in the sky occasionally, but the concept of bird no longer means anything to the people on this island. They then burn all of their pictures or books that they have which involve birds. And the same happens with a lot of things. So the concept of hats disappears. The rose disappears as something that they know. So they then snip off all the rose bushes and roses are no longer a thing. The novel focuses on a young novelist. She still writes books, but, well, her understanding, her imagination, her vocabulary gets smaller and smaller, right, as things disappear. At a certain point, we come to understand that there are certain people who do not forget. They still know what a bird is. They still know what a rose is. And they are, of course, a threat to the memory police. So at a certain point, she finds out that her editor is one of these people. And then the question becomes, how can she hide him? How can she help protect him, even as she keeps losing things? So for me, this was quite a difficult read in the sense that it feels deeply dystopian and totalitarian. It aligns quite nicely with certain elements of Orwell's 1984, for example, the idea that things are slowly but surely snipped out of existence and things are simplified until basically the question is, what is life about? We have nothing left. And there are a couple of really sad and sort of touching moments where our novelist sort of tries to remember things, but she just cannot, although it's not clear why she cannot. And yeah, so I found it a difficult read in that sense because it asks these questions of, well, how do you resist a regime like that? How are you participating in it yourself by allowing things to fade? The ending is very, very bittersweet. Or maybe just bitter, actually. But I think it's a beautiful novel. It is very calm and very quiet. So that might not work for people who want their dystopian fiction to be full of rebellion, resistance, struggle. That's not really what happens in The Memory Police, but I think it's a beautiful meditation on memory, on what it means to be alive, on what life itself means. So yeah, give The Memory Police a go. My next read was a delightfully gothic horror one called Hunger and Thirst by Claire Fuller. I read this while I was visiting family, and I was watching Something Very Bad Is Going to Happen on Netflix with my sister, which is also quite gothic. So that aligned perfectly with this read. Hunger and Thirst is divided across somewhat two different timelines. Part of our plot is set in 1987, where we meet a young girl, Ursula, who is still a teenager. She's 16 years old. And she's just sort of left the care system because she's an orphan, and she has a new job. She works in the post room of a local art school, and she's quite intrigued by this art. And we can tell that she has an artistic sensibility. And this is confirmed by the second timeline, which is her 36 years later, when she is a renowned but very reclusive artist. She mostly does sculptures. And there is a back and forth between these two timelines, as in the later timeline, the adult Ursula is somewhat hounded by a journalist who wants to include her in a documentary she's making about something that happened to Ursula and her friend group when they were younger, back in the 80s. And it's back in the 80s that the most overt sort of gothic elements of this novel come about. She is squatting in a mysterious house called the Underwood. Something happened there, something will happen there. Ursula's involved in it, but so is her friend Sue and her boyfriend Vincent. So Sue's boyfriend Vincent. From the scene set in the more futuristic timeline, when Ursula is an adult, we can tell that someone disappeared and that there might be a murder, right? And there is this haunting aspect to the 1980s storyline, which is, like I said, more overtly gothic. But the same takes place when Ursula is an adult. And I think the questions that this novel really asks is, are the monsters inside of us? Are they outside of us? What do we allow to haunt us? How do we confront these haunting, traumatic memories from the past? How do we work through them? And I really liked it. Claire Fuller has an excellent knack for characterization, but also details. And in that relationship between Ursula and Sue, she also really talks about that, well, as the title of the novel suggests, the hunger and the thirst that is involved in teenage female friendship. This almost mild obsession you can have with female friends at that time. So I can wholeheartedly recommend this if you're into gothic, if you're good with a little bit of gore, body horror vibes. And of course, it deals with the foster system, and there is death, there's on-screen, well, on-page death somewhat. So those are all things to bear in mind, but I thought it was great. I know that Claire Fuller has written a lot of books. I only read her other novel, Our Endless Numbered Days, back in 2015. And I haven't read any of her books since, and I don't know why. So that's something I'm going to have to rectify ASAP. After that, I read a book for work, which is The Public Scholar, a practical handbook by David M. Perry. This is a book, as the name implies, for people who work in scholarship and academia who want to be more public-facing with their research, but also just with their output. And he provides a couple of tips throughout this little book about how to do that, how to reach out to editors, how to pitch something. And I mainly read this to get some inspiration to figure out how I might put my own research or my own knowledge out there in different ways. So that one was for work. The next one was also for work. It was Late Medieval Icelandic Romances, the 5th volume in that series, which contains a couple of really exciting Old Norse Icelandic riddarasögur or chivalric sagas. And there were a couple in there that are new favorites. So Nitita's saga is amazing. We have this maiden king who just absolutely rules. She gets away with almost everything and only settles down when she is fully ready for it. There's a flying carpet involved. There's also Sigurðar's saga Fregna, which I also really liked. We have a curse there, an evil stepmother. We need to go liberate some sisters. We need to humble a slightly overly proud prince. So yeah, loads of good things in there. Of course, there's also a couple of sagas that I wasn't fully wowed by, but it's excellent. This volume is edited by Agnete Loth. And yeah, if you're into Old Norse Icelandic literature, or if you'd like to be into medieval literature, I think the Old Norse romances can be quite fun to dive into just because they're mildly insane. The next book I finished was The Odyssey. I've just done an entire episode on that, so I'm not going to get into it overly much here. But The Odyssey's great. And I read Emily Wilson's translation, and I think she is an excellent translator for the modern age. She doesn't necessarily update the language. She doesn't make it sort of overtly 21st century-esque, but she does make it very accessible, and her notes at the end are very extensive, so that's also very useful. Next, I read a romance. I occasionally try and dip into different kind of romance authors' works. I have one or two, well, two really, where I'm like, yes, I can read pretty much everything that they write because I will enjoy it. And then occasionally I try and dip outside of it. And that's what I did this month. I read The Last Page by Katie Holt. And on the one hand, I really liked it. And on the other hand, it did leave me somewhat unaffected. So The Last Page is set in a bookstore, which is called The Last Page. It's a local bookstore in New York City. It's got big history. And the man who ran it has recently died. And he sort of left Ella in charge of the bookstore. He set her up, he trained her to be the next boss. But then his nephew, Henry, rocks up, who has technically inherited the bookstore. And Henry is sort of like, he's not quite a tech bro, but he's a finance-esque bro, but with a heart of gold. And he's like, we need to make this store viable. We need to limit the free coffee. We cannot be getting cupcakes for birthdays. And Ella's like, how dare you just walk in here and pretend? But of course, he's super hot. And of course, she's absolutely gorgeous. And so their tension is fueled by steamy interests. And they need to figure out how to basically save this bookstore. And they need to see if they can get past their dislike for one another. We all know how this ends. And I did have a good time with it. I liked the surrounding characters, especially Ella's family was very cute. The other sellers in the bookstore, they're mildly New York cliches, but in a fun way. I don't think you need to look at these kind of novels for hard-hitting, realistic character portrayals, if that makes sense. But it does address some, big issues such as grief. And I think it does that pretty well. I will say most of the steamy scenes didn't do a whole lot for me. But there are a couple, so if you prefer your romances as a locked door kind of thing, then maybe this isn't it. But yeah, it was cute, I had fun with it, I was just left slightly cold by it in the end. After that, I finally finished the audiobook for The River Has Roots by Amal El-Mohtar. It's narrated by Carmella, but Amal El-Mohtar and her sister, Dunya El-Mohtar, they actually provide musical backing to the audiobook, which is stunning. So, okay, let me start from the beginning. The River Has Roots is a reworking of a murder ballad about two sisters, the Tway sisters, I think it might be called, and it's set in this somewhat magical version of England where magic is grammar, grammar is magic. We have two sisters, Esther and Isabel, and it is their job to sing to the trees that thereby engender magic. I'm not entirely sure, but they have to sing to these trees, and it's beautiful, and I'm not explaining it well. They tend to these trees. They are willow trees. They stand on the border between the real world and fairy realm. Eventually, we find out that Esther has a somewhat suitor from the fairy realm that she's really intrigued by, but she also has a suitor in the real world, and he's an absolute piece of And so she rejects him, and then something tragic happens, and we need to find out if these sisters can find their way back to one another. So if you know the murder ballad, then you know where the story is going to go. But what I really enjoyed about it is just the way Amal El-Mohtar uses language. It was beautiful, and it was read so stunningly by Carmella, who also sings some of the songs. And then we have Amal and Dunya's music in the background as well. So it was just, as an audiobook experience, it was absolutely stunning. I think this one probably actually works best as an audiobook just because it then has that performative element in the background. I love what it says about magic, but also perception and reality. It's about sisterhood. How far are you willing to go for your sister? It's about being lost and finding your way home. is gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, if you're into fun magic systems that maybe also work with language, especially grammar a little bit, then this is absolutely the one for you. It is also my first read by Amal El-Mohtar, and I know that they have a short story collection coming out that I want to give a go. That's probably going to be on my schedule for this summer. There is also a short story that is included in the audiobook at the end. It's kind of like a taster, a teaser, and I really like that one. And of course, Amal El-Mohtar did write This Is How You Lose the Time War with Max Gladstone, which I still haven't read, although everyone keeps telling me to do so. So maybe I should also dive into that one. Alrighty, the last book I read this month is The Limits of Critique by Rita Felski. This was also a book for work. This one was really useful for me to think about how I approach critique. Because I'm a literary scholar, I'm a medievalist, so I'm always diving into texts, right? And there are certain metaphors, certain ways of thinking, speaking, writing that separate critique from just general criticism. And I've been taught that pretty much from my first bachelor year. And I think, for example, one of the reasons that large language models are now so big on words like delve and dig deeper and blah, 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 is because that is a big part of how scholars in the humanities, but definitely in literary studies, write about texts. And of course, these LLMs have been trained on our writing. So that's why you see those metaphors there. But it's actually worth thinking about those metaphors a bit more deeply. And that's what Rita Felski does in this book. And I think she does it really well. I did feel somewhat called out in a good way for how I write, because we basically approach these texts like paranoid readers. And that's an idea that Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick developed. The idea that we're constantly questioning a text. We're like, what is it hiding from us? What isn't it telling us? We are trying to dig very deeper into it and almost like a psychoanalyst unearth a hidden truth or a hidden sin or a hidden trauma in each and every text. And while I think there's absolutely value to that, I do a lot of that sort of work myself, I also very much see where both Sedgwick and Rita Felski are coming from and saying, well, is this the only way of being critical? Or are there other ways of working with texts that are less paranoid, that are less suspicious, that are, in Sedgwick's works, reparative, or in Felski's word, post-critical, where we can also focus on what a text does with us as a reader, the emotional, even physical, affective experience of reading. And I do think it's important to think about that more critically, or at least to consider if we can't bring more of ourselves into our scholarship without losing the professional sheen of it. Because I think that's the worry. We don't want to be overly sentimental about these texts, and therefore we cut off, I think, certain avenues of research. Because if I talk too deeply about what a text means to me, then maybe I can get lost in the source, That's the sort of worry. So reading Rita Felski's book was really eye-opening to me. I made loads of notes and also wrote down a couple of references, texts that she referred to that I've now picked up from the library or bought. Wish me a whole lot of luck, because I bought a French academic book by Marielle Marcé about ways of reading and how this influences our lives, and my French is not that good. So we'll see how that goes. All right, that was my reading month. I would love to hear what you've read. So do drop me a recommendation in the comments if you read something that you enjoyed, and let me know if you've read any of the books I've read. All right, that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central. you.